Welcome to the eighth day of the 2020 Pragna 16 Days campaign against gender violence. I'm losing count of how, how many times we have partnered with Oranam during this campaign. I think this is the sixth of 10 campaigns, and this is one of our most solid partnerships. This is the one of the partners that we can call up and say, so what are we doing this year, and know that we will have a really excellent program. Because one of the unintended consequences of the pandemic has been that we can do things digitally. We have been able this year to invite a panel from all over India to be a part of this, as also to have an audience from everywhere. That makes this panel extra special for us, because we don't know if this will be possible ever again unless we continue to do digital programs. What about the campaign? We began this in 2008, uh, thinking it would be a one-off. We would do women's history, we would do women in politics, we would do everything else, and then for 16 days we would do a big event, which would be the 16 days campaign. But the first thing we learned going in was that you can't really withdraw from talking about violence. It is the dominant, the limiting, the inescapable condition of our lives, unfortunately. And so we got roped in. We found ourselves saying, sure, we'll come in February and we'll do a workshop, or April might be a good time for that discussion. And before you knew it, we had a year round program of working on gender violence awareness, which at times seems to dominate our lives a little more than it was originally intended. So, this is somehow, quite miraculously, our 10th campaign. We do three, then take a year off, do three again. So this is the beginning of the fourth cycle. And each year we think, this is too hard. And at the end of each campaign, we swear we will never do this again. But by July, the itch comes on. And by August, the withdrawal is acute, and by September, we're looking at campaign associates, and then come November, here we are. But we are always pleased and privileged and grateful to be able to do this and to work with wonderful partners. And I want to tell you something about the panelists that Ramki won't tell you, maybe. So this is an incredible panel. Of course, they're all very accomplished and articulate and all of that, but so are most panels, right? This is the only panel in 10 years that has spent 1 month discussing the panel on WhatsApp. This is incredible. This will never happen again in my lifetime. So I have enjoyed it. I'm excited about this, and I hope that you enjoy it as much as I do. We will be recording. We will also place individual presentations online, as shorter video clips that you can use later on. And we are now streaming on Facebook. Um, I will get out of your face in a minute, but after I introduce my old friend, Dr. L. Ramakrishnan, uh, who is who was first known to me as a Veena player, and now I will give you his official bio. L. Ramakrishnan is a public health professional associated with Solidarity in Action Against the HIV infection in India, SATI. He works towards inclusive health access to healthcare, justice, and social protection for communities marginalized on account of gender, sexuality, and or HIV status. Thank you so much, everybody. Over to you, Ramki.
Thank you very much, Swarna. So we are very happy to be doing this event, and I'll say a little bit about Orinam, which is a non-profit, unregistered collective of people from the LGBTIQA community in Chennai and elsewhere in Tamil Nadu. We've been around since 2003, and our work includes advocacy, archiving queer and trans resources, cultural programming, and we are really happy to partner with Prajna on these initiatives. So today we'll be talking about the violence of heteronormativity. Typically, when we're discussing family violence or domestic violence, we think of a lot of very overt forms of violence. But now, today, what we thought we would do is just speak about the expectations, rules, and conventions associated with the expectations associated with marriage, with childbearing, with gender roles, with patriarchy, etc., that can themselves impose violence on those of us who are not cis or not straight. So I'm very happy to welcome the panelists. I will start off with introducing Maya. Maya Sharma is from Vikalp Women's Group in Vadodara, Gujarat. She has been a long-time activist for women's rights and queer rights. She's the author of the 2006 book Loving Women, Being Lesbian in Underprivileged India, which is now in its second edition. So, Maya, welcome to this panel, and we'd love to hear from you about issues of queer women, the historical development of the queer movement, the invisibility. Perhaps you could speak a little bit about your work with women in rural areas and in indigenous or tribal communities. And we'd love to hear your way forward. Over to you, Maya.
So that's a long line you've given me, Ramki. I'll, I hope the others will pick up in the panel. But to begin with, I just want to begin with heteronormity. It's such a widespread net that it completely ensnares you, so much so that people like us who identify as queer also we have it inside and outside us, that it makes a lifelong struggle to understand it and to constantly fight it, as well as fight it outside. And major about heteronormativity is that if you look at the institutions that it embeds, it's generally the gender roles of or the division of men and women completely, and the division of the roles, and then the difference, the biological difference, to automatically make one subordinate and the other superior. And so it is also very closely linked to patriarchy, in the sense of men always dominating and women being unequal. But and that this kind of a system completely invisibilized the queer women. And initially, when we were finding our own feet, it was very difficult to really see uh, that women who loved women were out there, but we did not have except the experiences which found no um, echo outside us ourselves, and to recognize us. So we did not even have the language. Consequently, there was a complete invisibility. But as we started to work, we realized that these women indeed were breaking out of these, and perhaps were so mingled with the structure that we failed to see them. And so I would like to talk of how Dalit women were marriage, the absolutely important, or the constituent which makes patriarchy so rampant, is uh, is where the women had made use, because Dalit people don't see, or even the tribal don't see it as a sacred thing, and that it has to be once for a lifetime done thing. So a lot of Dalit queer women that we interacted with actually had married, separated, and were living with their partners, whether as neighbors or as a lifelong commitment, or as simply as friends. So we needed a different kind of eye, a perception, a prism to look at these women. But let me know, Ramki, how long am I to go on this?
Go ahead.
Okay. So this kind of invisibility created a lot of other issues, but I would also like to mention the tribal women who sort of actually made arrangements with their brother that you marry the woman I love, and then we'll be able to live together. And so it transpired that the brother married another woman, and these women till date are living together. And this I'm talking about Gujarat. So I would at the same time like to mention that what I'm speaking about is basically based from my field work. It doesn't encompass a large reality, but this is from where I'm speaking from my field experience. Also, I realized that we've always been seeing masculine women. Earlier, we did not have the terminology of transgender. The terminology that we first had was lesbian, which was actually coming from urban centers. But in UP during my research, I used to hear the word rangli, which was a relationship between women and women. But for transmasculine people, the word that was used was often babu or bhai. And these women were generally called mardani aurat. It's much later as we began to organize and get used to and familiar with the word transgender that a whole lot of other issue emerged. And we realized that transmasculine people, to a certain extent, enjoy a level of acceptance, of affirmation, because of the nature uh, of their ability to dwell both the worlds, the private and the public spheres, and in a sense contribute economically to the family. And so in many rural parts of our where we work, for example, even a Patel family was able to recognize and give space to this trans man because he was the masculine person, the only masculine person who could inherit the vast lands, the agricultural lands they have, and the daughters were all married off. So it made sense for the Patel family to accept him as well as the larger village. With reluctance, you do see a level of acceptance for transmasculine, but it is the partners that we work with have the hardest time ever because the and I'm not saying that the transmasculine do not have a hard time because they have also faced homelessness, uh, violence, and a lot of other issues with the state. But relatively speaking, if I can say so, from my work experience, is that their partners have a very hard time in terms of being dismissed from property rights, from never being able to return home, extremely violent, and of course forced marriage, which then ends up for the couple to leave no other way but to elope and find a space for themselves, which again is very troublesome for both for the couple because you're in an unfamiliar surrounding. All the social capital that you've had earlier is no longer there for support, and of course the outer world to is not very supportive. So I would say that overall, this heteropatriarchy system completely marginalizes the queer experiences because it is so divided in men and women pockets and the roles which play up in daily lives. For now, I think I've had my say.
Sure. Maya, would you like to share something about your personal journey and your encounters with heteronormativity that we were speaking about earlier?
Well, my personal life is actually because marriage is so embedded in your daily life that I had to get married. And when I did get married, I also produced a son, which was like the best thing you could do on this earth. But my my love for women basically got me into a lot of trouble in school to begin with, and then later on in my workplace as well, in my married life as well. But in my workplace, uh, in one of the women's groups, we were at that point of time asked not to raise the issue because it would unsettle a lot of other issues. And later on, even when I moved to trade union, uh, the I had just returned from my field work, and I realized that most of these women, transmasculine and women who live women, join the uh, the rebellious religious current that we call the Bhakti movement, and there women could dress in the form that they liked, which for women is very difficult. So they could wear dhoti, kurta, and live with the women as well, and pass by as a bhagat of the particular current, like Ram Snehi Bhakt and all. Later on in my research, I also saw that with couples who were eloping were running to these religious places, and I think this is. And so when I came for this, I attended a conference, and I was very happy to share my experience because this was an eye opener for me too. And I think the rest of the people in the conference, we had a very enjoyable session. But even before I reached my workplace, I was told that you lower the prestige of our organization by talking about such issues. And pretty soon, within months, I had to quit. And trade unions don't really tell you to quit, but they do it in a way that you have to quit. So I think this is another way of being violent, which is not direct, but very indirectly you are told to ease off and sort of get lost. And I got lost, but I found myself in the process. And here I am, still recovering myself.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Maya. So hopefully we'll come back to some of these issues you've raised in the discussion following everyone's presentations. So now I'd like to invite Mridul Dareja from Labia, a queer feminist LBT collective in Bombay, who will, I hope, speak about heteronormativity as it's perceived in the cis world, as well as how it's perceived in the trans world, and experiences of addressing and challenging the heteronormative aspects that come with masculinity and femininity. Please go ahead, Mridul. Welcome.
Hi, thank you, Ranjit. Okay, so the way that I understand violence of heteronormativity, and this is specifically from a trans masculine context, there are two types of violence that heteronormativity itself causes. Broadly, external violence, which is perpetrated by the larger society on the trans population, and there is internal violence, and by that I basically mean internalized heteronormativity within the trans persons as well. Causes for both are very similar. Obviously, the causes are the patriarchal notions of what gender is supposed to be, what men are supposed to look like, what women are supposed to look like, how are they supposed to behave, uh, what are their roles supposed to be, who can they have desires for, who can they be in relationships with. So all of those patriarchal notions are primarily the cause behind this heteronormative violence. In that sense, the way that one would look at heteronormativity is basically these boxes, like these very fixed boxes, and the labels that go with them. And anybody that tries to get out of these boxes deserves punishment. So in that sense, if you understand heteronormativity like that, then there isn't much difference between heteronormative violence and heteronormativity itself. So I mean, what I'm trying to say is that heteronormativity is heteronormative violence. There is no difference between them. Now, just to look at a couple of examples. In terms of external violence, which is the one caused by larger society or trans population, uh, uh, just a couple of examples. There are many more. One is obviously this range of microaggressions to macro aggressions that come our way. Uh, and then obviously there is outrightly violent transphobia as well that we hear a lot of reports about, specifically in the context of trans women, which is also in part because there isn't a lot of visibility around trans men and trans masculine persons as well. Another example would be refusing to acknowledge our identity or accept our identity, uh, refusing to use correct pronouns. This happens in the larger society, we know that. Unfortunately, it also happens in progressive spaces at times where the trans men are not recognized as men and trans women are not recognized as women. Then there is another example where either uh, either the society would completely ignore or negate our lived realities, which means that there is no need on their part to actually do anything to accommodate our lived realities and experiences, or then use those as a reason uh, to treat us as either dumb or less than or not capable or something on those lines. An example of that is what happened in the case of Trans Act, which is trans bill. I mean, the fact that the government would actually form a bill about trans people without talking to trans people about their lives. To me, it just sounds like they just thought that we don't know about our own lives and they know better. There's discrimination, obviously, and discrimination comes from the discomfort that the society faces when you bend gender rules, when you come out of both of those boxes. Again, I'm not trying to justify the discrimination, but the idea is that it stems from the same idea of heteronormativity. Another example, which again happens more in progressive spaces than in not so progressive spaces or families, is this voyeuristic curiosity about our bodies, about our lives. The people just come and write books that are teenagers, and I'm not naming the book because I don't want to give that person undue credit, but this happens. So just a couple of examples. In terms of internalized, like more internal issues, more internalized heteronormativity, I think one is understanding of masculinity itself. And again, this is coming from, I'm saying masculinity because I'm talking from a trans-masculine perspective, but the same applies to understanding of femininity as well, if you think about trans-feminine perspective. So the way to think about it is, let's say, when you are a guy and your gender is not getting acknowledged or understood, then what do? You assert your masculinity. Now, masculinity itself is a learned concept, right? There's nothing called inherent masculinity. We all learn it from men around us, and which is precisely how patriarchy propagates itself. Right? Everybody does patriarchy. The new people learn from old people how to participate in patriarchal ways of life, and then that's how it goes ahead. So then, if masculinity, the only way that we learn masculinity is by observing the traits of masculinity, quote unquote, traits of masculinity from men around us, then there is no vantage point to really differentiate between toxic masculinity and masculinity. Right? It becomes one and the same because that's all you know. And that leads to a lot of conflict in multiple ways. And so one exception to that would be people who have access to either feminist spaces or feminist literature. They can probably figure out a way to differentiate between, okay, this is toxic behavior and this is not, this is patriarchal and this is not. But then let's also not forget that access to these spaces is a matter of privilege in other parts of your life as well. Not everybody has access to the same spaces or the same literature. Another example of internalized heteronormativity, and this is kind of a stretch, but just hear me out, is dysphoria. Now, I'm not saying that dysphoria is purely because of heteronormativity. Of course, dysphoria is a very is a trans-star lived reality. A lot of us struggle with dysphoria to varying degrees. And I'm not even saying that if the society was not heteronormative, the dysphoria would completely vanish. The trans people will still probably struggle with it. We still look for surgeries and other medical interventions. But my point is, if the society was not this heteronormative, and if there weren't these strict rules about if you're a man, you're supposed to look like this, and if you're a woman, you're supposed to look like this is how your body is supposed to be, wouldn't the dysphoria be a little more manageable? I'll just give you an example. For example, till I had my doctor, till I went for medical intervention, I had severe dysphoria about my breast. Because obviously, I mean, if you're a man, you don't want to be seen as a person who has breast, and also because when people couldn't figure out what my gender was, they would stare at my gender, right? Just in an attempt to figure out, and which was obviously uncomfortable in itself. But so now I can't help but wonder if it was indeed normal for men to have breasts like that, wouldn't my dysphoria would have been a little more manageable? Still, I could probably access top surgery. I probably still could have wanted it, but it would not have been as painful as it was. Same thing can go for boys. I mean, if every time I talked on phone, people did not try to predict or assign a gender to me just based on the pitch of my voice, would I have been as bothered by the fact that my voice is higher pitched than what it is now? Another one that actually that is not something that seeking medical interventions helps as well, and that a lot of trans men in particular struggle with is height. So there's this idea about men are supposed to be tall, and as a man, if you're short, you are actually a butt of jokes. You look at all popular culture, you look at TV shows, you look at movies. Men who are short, women who are short, I'm sure go through that as well. But in particular, if you're a man and you're short, then there is something inherently wrong. And that's something that comes up in a lot of conversations within trans men. Nobody is happy about their height. It doesn't even matter how tall they are. And from my vantage point, everybody is tall. Let me just clear that. But it is still a problem. It's a cause for shame. It causes people to not want to go out. And that's internalized heteronormativity, right? So that was another example. There are times when this internalized heteronormativity also causes a lot of conflict, right, and is damaging to the larger cause as well. So I'll just give you an example. So again, this will probably be shared with people all over India, and not everybody might know of it. But Karwa Chauth is a North Indian thing where wives fast for the long lives of their husband. Now, as a feminist, I am totally against it, obviously, right? Because this is a ridiculous custom. But there was a time before I knew about feminism, before I could identify patriarchy, where I found that desirable. Because to me, that meant nothing more than the idea that was purported by the society, by the Bollywood movies, by the popular culture, that this is actually an expression of love. And so then for me, somebody doing that for me became actually an assertion of my masculinity. It became a way for me to feel masculine, to feel a man, which is problematic. But I'm saying is, what I'm trying to say is that at times you don't know. There are times when you don't know better, right? Another example is Rakhi. Rakhi is another thing, which is a festival, right, where sisters tie this Rakhi thing on your wrist. My family, my sisters actually started tying Rakhi to me as a token of their acceptance for my gender. So when I came out, they started doing that because they said, now you are also a brother, why should you be tied to the other brother, to my other sibling? They started doing that. It became a very positive thing because it was a token of love, it was a token of acceptance of my gender. But obviously, that itself is problematic as well. And I mean, you don't know this, you haven't met my sisters, but the whole notion that goes with brother is going to protect the sisters. I mean, if we are in a fight, the sisters will more likely protect me, then I will be able to protect them. So, the point is that it is important to understand that these traits that we see as toxic masculinity or even masculinity for that example are sometimes nothing more than either helpless or clueless assertions of a transmasculine person to be read in their own gender. Now, another example of that is so when men, and this is something that I've been sort of before the lockdown happened, I came across this a lot more in workspaces, in office spaces. The other thing about men is that when men get together, they talk about sexualizing women, they sexualize women, they talk smack about it, right? Not in ways that any feminist would appreciate. It actually makes you very angry. So if men are seeing you as one of them, they're going to do that. You are a part of that group. It is happening around you. And now you have to take that call whether I should say something to stop it or should I participate. Right? So, if you don't know that this is wrong, if you don't understand patriarchy and how that perpetrates, that's one thing. Then you don't know, then you participate. But even if you know that, okay, I want to say something, you still have to make that call because now you're worried, if I say something, will I be asked? Will they figure out that I'm not really one of them? This internalization of actually monitoring yourself more than you really need to. So there are many such examples. I can go on and on, but I think that sort of gets the point. So then, what is the way? The idea is that what we need is engagement with transmasculine, right? And when I say engage, reach out, this has to come from a place of trust. This has to come from a place of wanting to talk about it. Because if it is randomly reach out to strangers on social media, then that is not reaching out, that is calling out. And we need to differentiate between this. Now another aspect, and this is actually the final aspect of internalized heteronormativity and the conflict that it causes, is our relationship. And when I say I mean our relationship with our relationship as trans-masculine people, as trans men, with male privilege. And this is a big deal because a lot of times we also get blamed for wanting to transition only because we want access to it. This happens in popular discourse as well. So, what is surprising is that in the same conversations, nobody is talking about the fact that trans women transition and move away from that. So if transition was actually just about access to privilege, trans women would never transition, right? That is actually not even looked at. The thing is, privilege in the context of otherwise marginalized identities is problematic in itself. And it needs to be either left to that community, that group to figure out, or if you're engaging with it, then that engagement has to be handled with nuance. Just those top level hot takes are not really the way to go around, which is something unfortunately that happens more often than it should. And I'm using the term privilege because I don't know another term. But the way that we understand privilege is It's something which is there, which you have just because you're born. You don't have to earn it, right? Be it caste privilege or male privilege that we're talking about. In that sense, the male privilege enjoyed by trans men, I don't even know if you can actually use the same term, because your privilege can be taken away by a single step to the market. Like, how is it that it's not really the same level of privilege? But having said that, obviously, I can never say that you don't have access to the male. It's not so, like, as a compromise, I kind of use the word circumstantial privilege. So, in situations where you're being read as a cis guy, either because you're managing to pass, or because you have medically transitioned, so people outside cannot know. Only in those situations you do get access, limited access to male privilege, which is why I'm calling it circumstantial privilege. And as an example, so what I'm saying is, because of this circumstantial privilege, you still won't feel confident enough to go out for a walk at 1 a.m. like a cis man would probably do. But you will not be interrupted as often while you're talking if you're being read as a man, and that is actually a personal observation. Or you will be able to negotiate higher wages when you're talking to your employer. Also a personal experience, like this dramatic change once I transitioned and once I started passing his back. Now this conflict that comes out of access to this privilege is something that needs to be discussed more, talked more within the community, and with people outside who know better as well. Again, that's the engagement that I mentioned earlier, that has to happen, because this conflict will happen irrespective of whether you identify as a feminist or not, whether you've had access to feminist business and literature or not. If you've had, you will be happy about things being easier in your life, but you will be mad at how patriarchy operates at the same time. Not an easy place to be in. And if you don't know, if you don't understand how patriarchy works, you will still be confused as hell, because you won't know what changed suddenly. Right? It is still a different experience whether you can understand or not. So that is something that needs to be engaged in as well. And again, the cause of this is heteronormativity, right? The way the huge difference in the way that we treat men versus women. Now, in the end, all I want to say is that it's important to engage with all of this, question the existing system, and as trans masculine community, come up with our own brand of masculinity. As trans feminine community, come up with our own brand of femininity, however we want to define it. And it's easier said than done. It is not going to be simple by any way within the context of the larger society. Because now, if the brand of masculinity that you come up with, I'm only speaking as a masculinity example, but this applies to the whole femininity thing as well. So if the brand that you come up with is quote unquote softer than the aggressive toxic masculinity that we see, then you're going to be called not a real man. You know, you're not man enough, man up, and terms like that. And if it is just as aggressive as the toxic masculinity that we see, then you will be called as no better than toxic man, right? Then what is the point of you being a trans man? Then you're a lost opportunity. So it's not easy either way. We all have to figure it out individually for ourselves. Of course, there's need for engagement, but there is no one clear-cut answer. The only thing that I try to remember personally is that I don't owe anyone nothing.
Thank you, Mridul. That was mind-blowing, amazing. Hopefully, we'll continue this conversation in the discussion. Now, I would like to request Deepti to share some of her thoughts. Deepti has been a long-time volunteer of Orinum for nearly 11 years now. She's also a founder of a queer assigned female at birth support group, AFAB group called Chennai Queer Cafe. She's also been curating a popular podcast series with Kaushik from Bangalore. So Deepti, could you tell us a little bit about your context as a peer supporter, as someone who's intervened in many crises involving queer women and trans masked people, and how heteronormativity is played out in your life and the lives of people who you've interacted with as part of your work with Orinum and CQC. Go ahead, Deepti. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for the opportunity, and I'll get right to the point. So the first time I've heard of heteronormativity, I heard it a while back, I didn't start reading about it till I heard about compulsory heterosexuality in this video by a YouTuber called ContraPoint. So, which kind of led me to a document on Reddit, which was called "Am I a Lesbian?" which is literally like a questionnaire and of sorts. It's very easy. It's definitely helpful for people who are questioning, especially AFAB women who are questioning their sexuality. But by then I kind of knew that I was queer, but then it points out in so many different ways as to how in million ways we were taught that the only relationship that is valid is a heterosexual relationship. So it's kind of what Adrienne Rich also talks about in her paper about compulsory heterosexuality, and which is very, again, similar to heteronormativity and stuff. So Ramki, as you mentioned, I've been volunteering with Orinum and the queer spaces in Chennai since 2011. And as a peer counselor, I have seen both emotional violence, domestic violence, physical violence, and I've worked in crisis intervention and helped with legal support and offering shelter and stuff. And in all these years, I've started recognizing heteronormativity, how it's there in every minute of queer lives, whether it's the cliche of cis men saying, oh, you didn't meet the right man, or when it's a trans masculine AFAB person being harassed at work because they don't conform to the gender expression that is expected from somebody who's AFAB. So, and AFAB, like you explained, is the term I'm going to use a lot, which is assigned female at birth. So I feel for a lot of AFAB people, it starts from childhood where their gender expression is policed. Whether it's saying, like, whether it's my mother saying, you're not sitting properly, sit like a girl, or whether it's not letting AFAB people cut their hair if they want to, don't cut it short, who will marry you, or even as simple as some as an AFAB person would walk. So I think it gets worse as we grow up. Like when you are like at the marriageable age, for some of us it starts at 21, where I think a lot of us do still have the privilege to push it till we're like 30s, but then it does get very intense. Like personally, I've had a lot of emotional blackmailing and stuff, and it's not just emotional blackmailing. Of course, it also can become corrective rape or marital rape when you're pushed into. And in only situations like that, I've seen some of the couples who are forced into marriages and then face the horrible situation of marital rape, and then they kind of feel that they can't take it anymore, and then they choose to abandon their natal family, and then they look for community support and then form chosen families. And I have a couple of people who are like I mean, they still want the kind of validation from their families to accept them and stuff, but they do have a certain chosen family and they're happy with them. And then of course a little bit of light on corrective rape is when cis male rapes an AFAB person with an intention to cure them of their sexuality. And of course a lot of this goes unreported, and uh, even if things like this are taken to the law enforcement, I don't think they're always helpful, because I've seen people take a moral high ground and say, oh, why are you running after, this was told to a trans masculine person, where they were said, oh, why are you running after a girl, we'll find a nice boy for you to get married to. Or there was a situation where a trans masculine person was slapped in a police station, and they were told that 377 does not apply. By then, actually, 377 was read down, so, and they were told this does not apply in our states. It's a central government thing. It does not apply in our state. So, I mean, they at that point they hadn't still contacted the community, but then these were all told later. So it's just, I mean, going to the state and the law enforcement, although we have the law in place, is not always helpful. And personally, I've gone through a lot of marriage pressure when I was, I think, 25, 26, and the community in Chennai has been a huge support. And as you mentioned, Ramki, this has been this marriage pressure and the support that I received from the community has been a huge motivation for me to create the safe space that I've created in Chennai, Chennai Queer Cafe. Basically, the idea was to fight heteronormity, of course, and normalize queer conversations, queer existence, and a safe space to have discussions, whether it's the happy things or the tough parts. And as a peer counselor, I still get asked questions like, if there is somebody who is facing the marriage pressure and is taking the steps to run away from their natal family, they would be in the planning part, and I would listen to them. I would tell them, this is something that you can do, this is something that you need to be prepared. And at the end of it, they would be like, how long do you think, when do you think it'll get better? When do you think my parents will come around? Of course, I have seen it go, like, there were situations where in like 6-7 months things will get better, parents will be accepting, parents will be willing to listen. But then there are also people, after 2 years, they still get calls from parents saying, you've stolen money when you ran away from home, accusing them of stealing money from home. But over the years, I definitely agree, compared to like about a decade back, things have gotten better. And somewhere I think it's social media that is normalizing, whether it's gender expression or normalizing the fact that same-sex relationships do exist. And something that I've noticed in TikTok, although it is banned now, but then that has brought out a lot of that has actually cut a huge class barrier, which in a way I feel uh, clears the fact that queer identities or a lesbian identity is not just a Western import. So that, I mean, even in that place there is a lot of hatred when it comes to comments and everything, but then on somewhere there is the acceptance also. And yeah, so coming to my personal experience, I would say I was not like a very feminine kid growing up. I would like play cricket on the road, climb walls, not sit properly. So my mom was a single parent. She was never very happy with all this. So when I grew up around 23, 24, after my graduation, the marriage pressure started. I obviously didn't know the language back then, but then I knew for sure I didn't want to get married to a guy. So, and I was not very sure if I can come out to my mom. Thing also was that I didn't know any language. I didn't know the thing about coming out. But then it was there was no visibility, of course. So obviously, I know this is not something that is normal. So I never really wanted to talk about it. But then they kept pushing on and off. I said I wanted to study, and then I studied, and then they still kept pushing. Finally, I think there was a point where I came out to my cousin, my younger cousin, and then slowly, after a lot of thinking and understanding, I came out to my mom's sister. So initially she was a little unsure and everything, but then finally she came around. But then I don't know where again uh, can one say that they are completely accepting of my sexuality, because they still don't. They never, of course, initiate the conversation about this. And even if I somewhere start like things like, oh, I'm going to be a part of this workshop. It's about peer counseling, around queer people. They're like, oh, okay. They're not very open to taking the conversation ahead. So I don't know when I can say they're completely accepting of me. But then there are other uh, cousins in my family who are very accepting, who are friends with my partner, and that's like a welcoming side that I'm very happy about. But then of course, when I chose not to, at a point where I chose not to come out to my mom, uh, I could see the shame that she had in having a daughter who was 30 plus and unmarried. And recently my mom passed away, and a few years before that is when I kind of took a stand, saying that I'm not going to come out to my mom. It's fine, because if I saw it as a place where if I do come out, she's going to have this huge journey that she has to take, which is going to be very hard on her. So I chose not to come out. And the shame that she had in having a daughter who's 30 plus and not married, I see that in my relatives now. I mean, I'm not very close to my family as such, but I still see that shame, that emotional burden that they carry. And it's, I don't know the way around with my family, but then on a general level, when I go for peer counseling or some stuff like that, I think one thing I would tell everybody is that, you know there is support out there, there is social spaces, there is safe spaces out there. You just have to reach out. It will take time for you to be accepting of yourself and find people who are accepting, or even parents do come around. I've seen a lot of my friends come out to their parents, and a year, 2.5 years later, they are accepting of their sexuality and their partner. So, but then of course we need a lot of change in terms of whether it's workplace or whether it's movie writer rooms or mental health spaces or healthcare spaces. We definitely need a lot more conversations about queer lives or heteronormativity and stuff.
Thank you very much, Deepthi, for sharing your insights from your life as well as from your activism. Now, building on that, I request Sucheta Tenathy to share some of her thoughts. Sucheta is a PhD student at JNU and was last year a Rajaram Fellow at Prajna. She's done some very important work looking at conversion therapy and broadening the scope of conversion therapy and how it's understood. So over to you, Sucheta.
Thank you so much, Ramki. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm going to talk about the violence of heteronormativity and some of the nuances of conversion therapies. So the COVID-19 crisis has exacerbated a lot of social inequalities for all kinds of marginalized communities in terms of class, caste, race, ethnicity, gender, as well as sexual minorities and disabled people as well. In the case of the LGBT community all over the world, as well as in India, there have been a number of reports of the violence that they have been facing, particularly those who have been confined in hostile home environments, either with natal families who are not accepting of them, or with intimate partners who are abusive. So the violence against LGBT people has increased a lot during the lockdown, apart from, of course, loss of livelihood and limited access to essential medications and healthcare and all of that, as well as COVID healthcare, access to COVID related healthcare services as well. So one of the very stark instances that took place during incidents that took place during the lockdown was the suicide of Anjana Harish. And hers was not the first incident of a person taking their own life after being subjected to conversion therapy. But I think it was the context in which it took place, in a context that is already very hostile, very uncertain, and very very damaging to people whose lives are already precarious. That this particular incident has sparked a lot of conversations about conversion therapies and what should be done about them. So there have been sporadic contemplations, not detailed analysis, but contemplations about whether we need a very clear blanket ban on conversion therapies using legislation, legislative interventions. And there have also been some questions about how do you even identify conversion therapies? How do you measure them? If you want to take legal action, you're going to need data and statistics. And how are you going to find them? So these are a couple of questions that I wanted to address, based mainly on Anjana Harish's case. So just to quickly summarize what the case was about, Anjana Harish was a 21-year-old bisexual woman from Kerala who came out to her parents, and she was subjected to a range of conversion therapies. She was abducted. She was taken to a psychiatric facility somewhere in Coimbatore, and then she was forcefully admitted to two inpatient facilities that were de-addiction centers in Kerala. She was subjected to physical assault and a lot of medication, and none of these details were revealed to her. What she was admitted for, what these medications were for, none of those details were revealed to her. Of course, informed consent was not taken. And finally, when she was released from the center, the second center in Kerala, she managed to go to Goa with the help of some friends, and her parents continued to harass her there. And she had to even go to a police station because of a complaint that her parents had made. And with all this stress and this trauma, she took her life in May. And she released a video giving a very, very detailed descriptive account of the harrowing experiences that she had faced in these centers. So some of the important points that emerge from Anjana Harish's case are the role of the family in conversion therapies. Very often, it has been found the world over through United Nations reports, the American Psychiatric Society, etc. These bodies have found that families play a very critical role in administering conversion therapies. There is also a very important component of conversion therapies carried out in informal settings and religious settings as well. In fact, it has been found by ILGA, which is a group that works on LGBT rights in Europe. In their report, they have found that informal forms of conversion therapy outside of formal medical systems are highly pervasive. These include religious forms of conversion therapy as well. Of course, then there are medical professionals, including psychiatrists and a range of other medical professionals as well, who are responsible for conversion therapy. The other thing that is very significant is that a lot of focus on conversion therapy tends to look at practices that are very explicitly coercive, and that take place in some kind of an institution, either a medical institution or a legal or a religious institution. So these could include like what Anjana Harish herself was subjected to. It could be abduction, forcefully admitting someone to an institution, hormone therapy, or some other kind of medication, electroconvulsive therapy. But there are also other more subtle forms of conversion therapy that could take place within institutions themselves. For instance, psychotherapy and religious counseling are very often difficult to identify as conversion therapies. They are conversion therapies, but they are much more insidious. Their violent connotations are a lot lesser. Moreover, there is conversion therapy which does not take the shape of a therapy per se. First of all, there is a lot of questions about whether conversion therapy should be called therapies at all, since they are just forms of violence. But and what also happens is that very often families themselves carry out what I would say curative violence against their family members who identify as gender and sexual non-conformative. These could take the forms of forcefully confining someone to the house, or removing them from the house, or physical assault, or emotional blackmail, or destroying their personal property. These forms of conversion treatments or conversion attempts are not therapeutic in that sense. And they challenge this idea that conversion is something that takes place within an institution. And it's going to be very, very difficult to identify these instances that take place within the home, with intimate family, or with even with religious leaders, because a lot of LGBT plus people's lives are already very precarious within the community. If they're going to come out and report many of these instances that take place in close settings, in close community or family settings, they would probably experience a lot of fear about what is going to happen to these people, as well as what their status in the community is going to be. So it's very hard to measure or document conversion therapy or conversion treatments or curative violence in any form. So my argument in this particular presentation is that we don't really need any more laws for conversion therapy or any other kind of curative violence, because we already have a lot. I'm going to cover a little bit about what we currently do have. And I'm going to emphasize the fact that it is largely about tackling structural inequalities through various interventions, including counseling, the media, and inclusion of medical professionals in advocacy efforts that are likely to be much more effective than instituting any more laws. So, just to quickly define conversion therapy is used as an umbrella term to describe interventions of a wide ranging nature, all of which have the common belief that a person's sexual orientation or gender identity can and should be changed. Such practices aim or claim to aim at changing people from gay, lesbian, or bisexual to heterosexual, and from trans or gender diverse to cisgender. Depending on the context, the term is used for a multitude of practices and methods, some of which are clandestine and therefore poorly documented. So, a common acronym used for conversion therapies is sexual orientation change efforts, which have also been expanded to include from SOCE, sexual orientation change efforts, to include SOGICE, sexual orientation and gender identity change efforts. And like I mentioned, even calling them therapies in many ways is misleading because they don't really have any kind of therapeutic potential. At the same time, there have been some studies suggesting that some forms of conversion therapy could be regarded as torture in the legal sense, using the United Nations definition of torture. But again, because many of them don't explicitly take on that kind of coercive form, not all forms of conversion therapy could be classified as torture, but that still does not declassify them from being violent. At present, there are only 4 countries in the world that have blanket bans on conversion therapy. Those are Ecuador, Brazil, Taiwan, and Malta. And there are partial bans in various forms in the US, Germany, some parts of Australia. Some of these bans are only on children being administered conversion therapies, while others are blanket bans on everyone. So, I'm going to briefly mention some of the legal mechanisms that currently exist to deal with conversion treatments. One is definitely the Mental Health Care Act. A number of provisions in the Act can be used to prevent these treatments from taking place or to take action against someone who is administering them. So, the Mental Health Care Act has given every citizen of India the right to mental health care. So, we are in a very interesting situation in India where we don't have a right to healthcare per se, but we do have a right to mental health care. And it is specifically mentioned here that you cannot discriminate against people, which means you cannot deny people access to mental health care on the basis of either gender or sexual orientation. So everyone is entitled to it. At the same time, there are a number of provisions for informed consent within the Act, including, and this is of particular relevance to the Anjana Harish case, Chapter 12 of the Act contains various provisions about admission, treatment, and discharge of people who are admitted in various mental health institutions. For those who are admitted independently, as well as Section 9 of this particular 89 of this chapter, which talks about people who are admitted through a nominated representative. Even if a person is admitted through a nominated representative, they still have the right to informed consent. And there are a number of other provisions about the way their rights have to be safeguarded and the reporting that the institution has to do to the state mental health authority when they admit people through a nominated representative. So these are some of the provisions, apart from, of course, the fact that um, the Mental Health Care Act also says that mental illness per se has to be defined in accordance with international conventions. And since homosexuality in particular is not considered to be a mental illness either in the DSM or the ICD, gender identity disorders does currently exist in the ICD-10. It's going to change in the ICD-11, where it's going to be shifted out of the chapter on mental disorders into a chapter on sexual health. So in that sense, there are a lot of protections available against conversion treatments within the Act itself. And of course, the Section 377, the Navtesh Johar judgment itself, clearly mentions that conversion therapy should not be administered because homosexuality is not considered to be an illness. So these are, besides, I also want to emphasize that other forms of conversion treatment, like say corrective rape or domestic violence, should actually be tackled by the other existing laws in the country rather than taking them up under a separate ban on conversion therapy, because these are not going to be easy to identify. So again, like I've already mentioned, the role of the family, because the family plays such a critical role in conversion treatments, these issues with the family need to be taken up very sensitively, and a law might not be the best way to go. Sensitization, changing attitudes towards LGBT plus people, working with communities, working with families, and networking amongst mental health professionals, religious leaders, and LGBT plus organizations is likely to help much more. But what I want to emphasize and discuss a little bit is the importance that is given to mental health professions in conversion treatment. So that all over the world, mental health professionals have played unfortunately, a very major role in administering conversion treatment. So there are specific laws prohibiting them in particular because of the role that they have played. In India, mental health professions are very unregulated. For psychiatry, there is a clear licensing system that is available. For psychology, we currently don't have a very consistent licensing system. So there is a licensing system that is available, but it's very irregular. It's only available for people who have a background in clinical psychology or in rehabilitation psychology. You need to have an MPhil for it from a specific institution to be able to apply for a license, and you don't even actually need an MA in psychology right now to practice as a counselor. So because of all these factors, apart from the fact that one of the defining features of the Indian healthcare system is medical pluralism, which is that we have many different systems of medicine. We have Ayurveda, homeopathy, Unani, and very interestingly, all these forms of medicine are also recognized under the Mental Health Care Act, but they have varying degrees of recognition. Yes, they do have government recognition, but there's also a very large unregulated healthcare sector. In this situation, while the existing law can be used as a professional safeguard against conversion treatments, without some kind of community engagement and again attitudinal changes, catering to issues of structural access to mental health care facilities, it's going to be very hard to control medical professionals or any other alternative healthcare professionals from carrying out these treatments and even identifying what these treatments might be. What has been recommended in some parts of the world which have much more regulated mental health care systems is that professional bodies be actively involved in advocating against conversion treatment. So in India, for instance, a lot of associations, the Indian Psychiatric Society, the Indian Association of Clinical Psychologists, as well as psychiatric social workers, have issued statements against conversion treatments. What happens with, again, outside of the Indian Psychiatric Society, for psychology, there is no single professional body. I said there are these bodies, but there's no single professional body um, that is equivalent, say, to the IPS. And even the IPS is not a statutory body. So it's much harder uh, for that to be implemented in India. But definitely it is something that has already been taken up and should be furthered about ethical practice, about professionalism in medical practice. That is definitely something which should be taken up, not just in the PSY professions of psychology and psychiatry, but across all medical professions as well as the alternative healthcare sector. The other question that I've already spoken about is that a lot of visibility is given to explicitly violent forms of conversion treatments and not to the more subtle ones. And those would have to be tackled in more tactful and subtle ways. I want to mention this as my final point, and it's a point that has been of concern to me for a while, and I'm still grappling with how to articulate it. But conversion, if let's just take the Anjana Harish case, for instance, what happened to her should not happen to anyone who actually has a mental illness. This is not to say that she had a mental illness or anything like that, but the kind of treatment that was meted out to her, forcefully like abducting her, forcefully admitting her to an institution, administering treatments without her knowledge, no informed consent, physical assault, this should not be happening to anyone who is in an inpatient facility at all. They could actually have a substance abuse disorder, and this kind of treatment should not be meted out to them. So, what we need to do, I think, as LGBT plus people, is that we shouldn't uh, subtly normalize this violence by saying, oh, we are not disabled. This should not happen to us. This should not happen to anyone. Similarly, there is a lot of work that has been done. Bhargavi Davar and Renu Adlaka have spoken about psychiatric violence against women. This is they speak specifically about cis women. So that is also something that we should be collaborating with, because the only way to handle conversion treatments, or I don't like the word conversion treatments, I'm just using it because the familiar term. I personally prefer the term curative violence, but because this conversion therapy and treatments are more commonly used term. But the only way to tackle curative violence is a multi-layered, multifaceted approach through networking of multiple organizations, professional, non-professional, activists, families, and all this is necessary. We should also be networking with organizations working with people with mental illness, so that there can be a healthier society for everyone. So heteronormativity, for me, would mean actually a basis for collectivizing with groups of people whose violence might be arising from heteronormativity, but it might not explicitly be so. So this is what I have to say for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sucheta. So, and thank you to all the panelists for sharing your thoughts and experiences and insights.